Hi everybody, I'm Peter Laws and this is the Flicks the Church Forgot, where I'm continuing my look at the 1989 Stephen King movie Pet Sematary. This is the third in a multi-part episode, so you can watch part 1 for a review of an upcoming feature documentary on Pet Sematary called Unearthed and Untold. Watch part 2 for my review of the film itself. But now in part 3, I'm going to be exploring the deeper themes that we find in Pet Sematary, not least the themes of death and grief, which it explores in relentless detail. And funnily enough, the film ticks off every form of grief you can think of. Murder, death by disease, accidental death, suicide, all the big ones are featured here. It's like a showcase for mortality. But the film's also about the pain of grief as well as death itself. So I love how the film doesn't shy away from exploring all aspects of that. John Abrams on chud.com makes a good comment. He says, even those who predicted where the movie is headed may still be shocked to see that it actually goes there. I think that's a good point. Death fuels a lot of horror, but some movies explore violence to the body, like slasher movies. Some explore the power of the afterlife, like paranormal movies. Some films explore the pain of grief, like horror dramas such as Don't Look Now. But Pet Sematary says, let's do it all. Pet Sematary is like a crash course in all the different themes of death, which is precisely why I think it appeals to so many people, because it's like an exploration into something that is important and relevant to you and to me. But its insistence on pushing all the buttons of the death machine means that it is sometimes not liked because of its bleakness. It kills anybody it likes. It doesn't obey the rules of many films, particularly when it comes to the child. For deeper exploration, by the way, of that subject, then check out episode 61 on my podcast, where I explore the taboo of child characters being killed in movies. A cheery subject, but I think a pretty interesting one. Now, this is a taboo that Pet Sematary breaks. One of my subscribers of the YouTube channel, Ed Hill, puts it perfectly when he says, Pet Sematary revels in its bleakness. I think that's a very shrewd way of putting it. Certainly Stephen King seemed to think so. In 1980, he was interviewed by Rolling Stone, who asked him about the novel he'd just been working on, and it was Pet Sematary, and of it he said, it's done, but it's put away. I have no plans to publish it in the near future. It's too horrible. It's worse than The Shining or any of the other things. It's just too terrifying. When I first saw this film, I was a teenager. I had no kids and no concept or thought of having kids myself. So watching the film was frightening and scary on a particular level. But seeing Pet Sematary again as an adult father now, I was surprised at how much deeper the feelings were about it. I don't want to suggest that you have to have a kid to have empathy for parents on screen. I think that's a bit patronizing to say that. But what I am saying is I personally have noticed a difference in me, that before I didn't have that much empathy for these sorts of situations. It was all right, but now I feel like I have. I've got a 4-year-old son, not much more older than Gage in the film. And at one point in the documentary, they mention how they achieved the special effect of Gage being in the road in the path of an oncoming truck. They used a huge mirror, basically. And I thought, wow, what a cool theatrical technique. I'll check that out. And so I decided to watch just that scene, just to see how effective that special effect was. And it was the first time I'd seen Pet Sematary as a parent. And do you know what happened? I saw the kid running into the road, and my brain just said, don't watch this. I switched it off. It just pressed in on a part of me that wasn't there when I was 14. Again, I'm not saying that I won't watch the film again. Far from it, quite happily. But at the time, well, it was after midnight. My brain was just simply saying to me, don't put that image in your head before you go to bed. Don't see the funeral scene. That really freaked me out as a kid, because now it would challenge me in a new and more intense way, for me personally, anyway. But rather than me sit here now and say, so really, on retrospect, I think they should have toned Pet Sematary down, I am the absolute opposite. I am hats off to a film that treats death and grief with respect and appreciates how crap and horrible it is and how it can hollow you out. Remember, this was the 1980s. This was the era of the A-Team, smashing cars off cliffs and everyone being fine afterwards. A year or two earlier, Stephen King had an adaptation of The Running Man, which came out, which had Schwarzenegger doing the usual thing of being indestructible and blowing people up with wisecracks, and there being no sense of loss at the characters dying on screen. Fine. That's the type of movies that they were. But Pet Sematary comes along and says, hang on a minute, death isn't something to laugh at. or that we can smack down with a big enough gun. It's real, and our dealing with it is real too. Because we all have this connection with other people, and when it's severed, we struggle to know how to be. I think this shot in particular gets to me. This picture of Creed carrying his son around in a backpack. It's such a normal and mundane image. In films, the hero isn't often pictured in such a domestic and average-looking position as Creed is here. And when I saw this image as a teenager, this picture barely registered to me. But these days, I look at this shot and I instantly picture myself. I've got a daughter a few years older than my son. I've got the same setup as those guys have. I carried my son around not in a backpack, but walking around with him up here, and I love there's a sense of mundane beauty in this picture, which says, this is just what family life is like. These are like my Saturdays, as it were. But this shot is also a creepy reminder that the time in the film is coming when Creed won't see his son Gage anymore. Gage will not be in his eye line anymore, and he'll be gone, and it'll be weighing on him and creeping up on his back, and it'll be heavy. You could say that this picture sums up the gentle image of the dead never really leave us, that we carry around with them, and could be a comforting shot. And I suppose it could be, yeah. But in the world of Pet Sematary, it's saying, no, this isn't comforting. The dead are coming for you with aggression. This will never let you go. Perhaps one could even say that the people we love are like the proverbial monkey on the back, the drug we can't quit. Ditching drugs and going cold turkey is devastating, and in a similar way, when you lose someone you love, it's very much like that. We suddenly realize how addicted we were to their presence. There's nothing wrong with that. But without it, we go into meltdown. So that if there was ever a chance of getting that drug back, that companionship back, we would take it. Enter the Micmac burial grounds. So the original movie and the novel is, in one sense, about death. Yet it's also a film that says we feel most human and most alive when we are with the people that we love. And when they're gone, we are shadows of ourselves. I think that's the clever irony of the documentary, which I reviewed in the last episode, because it ends up being a celebration of the very same thing. It's a celebration of the power of community, the power of working together to create something new, of being together, but also the simple need we have of other people, that God, or however you would want to view it, has made us not to function well in isolation, that we have a kind of special connection with other people around us. So this documentary is a celebration of that sense of community to come together to make a film. But the original film is a chilling exploration of what happens when that community is taken away. Taken together, I think they make a fascinating dual view of the wrongness of death and losing one another, and the rightness of life and finding one another while we still can. But as well as being a film about death, there are some other themes I think that we can draw out of Pet Sematary. As an Englishman, it's always interesting to me to see horror films that explore the latent sense of American guilt concerning the Native Americans. There's a few obvious, significant horror movies that use the tainted Indian burial ground as a source of bad things, as well as Pet Sematary. The Poltergeist and the Amityville Horror are the two examples that immediately come to my mind, at least. And one can read this angle in two ways. In one sense, this Indian burial ground haunting thing is a feeling of subconscious guilt that the Americans have pretty much removed or buried an entire people group, and so the spirits of those slighted ones will return to seek vengeance. So it's a kind of guilt narrative, that makes sense. But the other explanation of why Indian burial grounds would be a source of horror is rather more sinister. And that is that the spirituality of the Native Americans is seen as somehow dangerous and sour compared to the clean, upstanding faith of the Christians. Like the Pet Sematary of the film, it's a strange, that Pet Sematary is a strange but sweet place for people to pass their loved ones on to the next. But the Indian version of it screws that up and turns people into monsters. That's the bad one. And I rather suspect that the Native American spirituality trope in horror is a combination of these two things. A feeling of guilt of that people were forced out, but also that fear of cultures that are different to our own. I was looking into this Micmac burial ground stuff the other day, and I found a forum where Pet Sematary was being discussed. And someone had asked on that forum why the burial ground turned animals and people evil. And there was a reply from a poster who's called Listener, and he said this: "'Cause Stephen King's such a friggin' genius, he doesn't have to make sense." Plus, hello, what part of ancient Indian burial ground don't you understand? I mean, does the word duh mean anything to you? Jeez, people, some things are just obvious, and some things are just obvious. His answer did make me laugh, but it's still a pretty telling one. Basically, the assumption is that it's Indian and spiritual, so obviously it will be a destructive force. Couldn't have any positivity to it. That's an insight into how one culture can get afraid and incredulous toward another. For Christians, their faith can make perfect sense to them, but other faiths can sound exotic and strange or nonsensical or even dangerous. It reminds me of the stand-up comedian Bill Burr. In his Netflix film, I'm Sorry You Feel That Way, he makes a pretty amusing point when he talks about how he used to see other religions as utterly ridiculous. He was a Christian back in the day, but he would see Scientologists being like into aliens and stuff, and he'd be like, wow, that makes no sense. And yet his own Christian faith at the time felt so rational, even though when you stop to think about it, Christianity itself is pretty out there too. It's just we have that tendency to view other belief systems as not just different, but as make less sense or even be threatening and frightening. You see this in The Exorcist, which opens with the Muslim call to prayer. I remember as a kid being really scared by the man singing because it was in a different foreign language I couldn't understand, and I just didn't get it. What is this? What's he saying? Or for example, I was listening to the soundtrack to The Last Temptation of Christ by Peter Gabriel once, and that employs a lot of world music influence and voices, and someone heard me listening to that music with its foreign sounding voices, and they suggested that I turned it off because it sounded dodgy. You know, like as a Christian I shouldn't be listening to that. As if Middle Eastern sounding language can't possibly be Christian, which is so ironic when you think about it, when you think about the origins of where Christianity came from. I mean, in the last set of episodes I talked about mutant bodies in horror and the fear we have of those who look physically different to us, but in Pet Sematary and Poltergeist and the Amityville Horror and others, in some ways I think these films sort of like play on a different theme of fear, the fear of those that have different religious systems to us, basically. Indeed, for some people in the Western world, Christianity itself is becoming a good source of horror because more and more of us feel separated from it, and therefore it feels foreign enough to be frightening. But despite this point about ancient Indian guilt and prejudice, the film Pet Sematary is still at its heart about death. Stephen King commented on this in the introduction to an edition of the novel that came out in 2000. And he said, I'm particularly uneasy about the book's most resonant line, spoken by Louis Creed's elderly neighbor, Judd. Sometimes, Judd says, dead is better. And I hope with all my heart that this is not true, says King. And yet within the context of Pet Sematary, it seems to be. Funnily enough, that line from Judd reminds me of a friend I once knew, a Christian, who actually had a fundamental fear of something many believers rejoice in. He hated the idea of eternal life. He feared it. He said he loved having faith in God, and the idea of a companion and guide here on earth was cool, but he was much more comforted by the idea or the hope that when he died it was the end of everything. He thought that like he would go on and furthermore go on into infinity. That was too terrifying for him to imagine. Now, I had a talk recently at an event in a Costa coffee shop here in my town, and I chatted with an atheist there afterwards who shared the fears of my Christian friend. Both of them thought surviving death in some form scared them. They felt, in short, that dead really is better. I understand their fear and I respect their view, but I suppose I'm a little bit more like King in that I hope that dead is not better, unless I'm living in the world of Pet Sematary, where life before death is pure and good, yet life after is aggressive, twisted, and psychotic. These bodies come back and they're bent on evil, in which case dead really is better. This theme is taken up in Stephen King's recent novel Revival, which certainly paints death as an incredibly bleak and undesirable state. I'm not surprised that King also found that novel frightening, because that book really does touch on the same fears that fuel Pet Sematary, the idea that heaven and a better life after death is in some ways a sort of naive fallacy, and then instead we all face not oblivion but conscious bleakness after our hearts stop. Another way of explaining why the bodies of Pet Sematary come back as evil could be through the approach that Wes Craven took on his mid-1980s TV film, Chiller. It was a bit of a silly little film, but it was alright, where a business executive, Miles Creighton, dies and gets cryogenically buried and preserved, and the hope is that he'll be revived at a later date when medicine's advanced enough to operate on his ailment. Sort of put a pause button until science catches up approach, which is an intriguing idea that used to be in for a while. Anyway, Craven has him thawed out and he's walking and looking normal and healthy, only there's something morally wrong with him. He isn't quite right. In fact, he ends up being downright homicidal because, as the film points out, he lacks a soul. That was what made him good. Now, is that why the dead in Pet Sematary are evil? Because their spiritual soul has gone off into heaven and we're left with an essentially evil and instinct-hungry flesh and no more? Well, I'm a fan of the late Wes Craven, but I'd suggest that this binary flesh is bad, soul is good thing, it's an example of a common misconception about life after death, which is both outside and inside the church. There's a view among lots of people, whether they're religious or not, that our bodies after our death will be spiritual, and that our physical bodies, this stuff, will just be discarded. However, the Bible and the early church do tend to teach something a bit different from that. They point out that the original creation was good, and so God wants to get it back to how it was and redeem it rather than just ditch it and put it out of the way. However, as history went on, the ancient Gnostics denied this idea, and then Plato's followers did the same. The basically Platonic ideas started to influence culture in the church, which said, and they still influence us today, that said the body is evil and it traps the soul, so we really should get rid of it. But the soul is the immortal core of humanity, but the physical world's an illusion. It's not good, it's sort of polluted. Let's ditch it, let's get rid of it. With these Platonic ideas in our psyche, some Christians today are suspicious of the body. They get hung up on sex because it's of the flesh, which is somehow bad. Even though God declared it good in the beginning. But we feel it's the soul that makes the flesh good. Can you see how Wes Craven or certain readings of Pet Sematary can use this idea to explain why the resurrected bodies are bad because they lack the spiritual element? But also it can lead to some Christians thinking not cool thoughts that basically we're on a mission to ditch this world. Both our world and our bodies. Hence we have theology that say, Jesus is coming back and we just got to wait, hang on till that happens, and we'll vanish with him from this planet and we'll meet him in the sky in the rapture and head off to some new place as spiritual beings. This can lead to some Christians seeing no value in environmental issues, for example, because this world is just an old rock which we're going to ditch in favor of the spiritual mansion we will be given in the sky. But various scholars argue that this escape theology isn't that biblical. The idea of us going to meet Jesus in the sky, they argue, is not so much us leaving the planet, but it's us going out to meet a king to escort him back to his palace, i.e. the renewed heavens and earth. So the Christian hope is not necessarily that our bodies will be worthless after death, but rather that our bodies will be the centerpiece of our renewal. N.T. Wright puts it this way: we sometimes say that after death we might become a shadow of our former selves. But like Gage is in the film, a dark version of who he was. But actually the Christian hope says that we are now a shadow of our future selves, and that we'll become more fully who we are after death, not just spiritually but physically, manifested in flesh. In that case, dead really is better. To conclude, let me just say that a quick word about the novel Pet Sematary. Before I saw the film, I did read the novel a few years before, and I recall it being one of the creepiest King novels I'd read. Still to this day, I vividly remember sitting on my windowsill, way after my parents had told me I should go to sleep, and I was reading Pet Sematary by the glow of the street lamp outside. And I used to read a lot of horror and spooky books like that, and I have this really clear memory of reading the part where Dr. Creed has just buried his dead cat in a plastic bag up at the cemetery, or rather just beyond it. Then the next day, I think it is, the cat returns. Only it seems to be acting a little different, what's wrong with it? And there's this one detail. Creed notices something snagged in the cat's teeth, and as he looks closer, he spots the sliver of plastic from the bag he buried it in. Oh my word, I remember when I read that, I can vividly remember myself going, like, and they're looking around. I'm just suddenly being reminded of the power of horror, but the power of novels and writing to really get into your head and stay. Pet Sematary is both a novel and a film that has managed to do that, I think. Well, while various critics write it off as bland and cliche and inept, there were millions of others, including myself, which saw it as anything but. Perhaps that was because of its excellent story structure, or its spooky imagery, and its foreshadowing, or its great music, or its relentless and fearless approach to the subject matter, or perhaps it's simply because it's one of the few horror films of the time that was willing to say, hey, death is real, maybe we should think about that a bit. It's funny how a little VHS box on a shelf, or a DVD or a Blu-ray, or a stream on Netflix or wherever can be a 90-minute portal into the very heart of what it means to be human. Pet Sematary, flaws and all, is a great example of how the themes of horror are often the most profound. Well, that's it for the Flicks the Church Forgot. Thank you for listening. Please share and subscribe on YouTube, and follow me on Twitter at Rev Peter Laws, or visit the website, The Flicks the Church Forgot. Also, you can also read my column in the Fortune Times magazine. But until next time, enjoy horror, but embrace life. And don't forget, The Flicks the Church Forgot.